When I first moved into the neighborhood, I had no intention of drawing attention to myself. After decades of serving the public in some of the most demanding and often politically heated environments, all I wanted was peace. I chose the small, gated community not because it boasted luxury, but because it seemed quiet, orderly, and tucked away from the chaos I had known for most of my professional life. The homes were modest but well kept, the lawns mostly neat and the streets clean. At the time, I thought I had found the perfect place to enjoy some semblance of normalcy. The property itself was nothing extraordinary, an aging brick house with wide front windows, a shaded porch, and a yard that, while in need of some work, showed promise. I wasn't looking for prestige or grandeur. I was looking for somewhere I could call home without the noise of constant public scrutiny. Still, I underestimated just how much scrutiny awaited me, though this time it came not from the outside world, but from within the very community I believed would give me refuge. From the moment I signed the paperwork, the Homeowners Association made its presence known. A thick packet of rules and regulations was handed to me, filled with the kind of excessive micromanagement one might expect in a community that confused itself with a private kingdom. Everything from the acceptable length of grass to the precise shade of beige approved for exterior paint was carefully documented. At first, I skimmed through the rules, confident that I had no intention of stepping out of line. After all, I was no stranger to law, order, and procedure. Still, the warning signs came early. A week into moving in, I found a notice taped to my door about a compliance check related to a garden hose I had left unrolled near the driveway. The tone of the notice was unnecessarily harsh, the language almost threatening, as if the simple act of failing to coil a hose was a declaration of war against the neighborhood. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a form letter sent by some overzealous volunteer with too much time on their hands. Little did I know this was the first tug at a thread that would unravel far more than I expected. The face of this obsessive control revealed itself soon enough. The HOA president. She carried herself like a monarch presiding over a fragile empire, walking the streets with a clipboard, inspecting lawns and driveways with the intensity of a military drill sergeant. Residents whispered about her behind closed doors but rarely stood up to her. It wasn't difficult to see why. She wielded fines like weapons, turning trivial complaints into financial burdens. Many had learned it was easier to comply, or at least to stay beneath her radar, than to challenge her authority. At first, she treated me with forced politeness. I was the new arrival, after all, and she seemed intent on setting the tone. She introduced herself briskly, rattling off the history of the neighborhood and the importance of preserving standards. I listened politely, suppressing my instinct to push back against her authoritarian demeanor. Over the years, I had learned the power of silence and restraint. I wasn't here to make enemies, and I certainly wasn't here to start battles over something as mundane as lawn ornaments or trash can placement. But restraint has limits, and in communities like these, authoritarian control doesn't end with small things. It grows. Each time someone complies without resistance, the authority grows bolder, more invasive, more convinced of its invulnerability. I watched as my neighbors endured petty fines, public shaming in newsletters, and even threats of liens over minor issues. Some of them looked tired, resigned, as if they had accepted their fates under her reign. Others whispered in private, careful never to let their frustration be overheard. I remained patient, but I also remained observant. Years of experience had taught me that bullies, whether in schoolyards, offices, or communities, always reveal their patterns. They operate under the assumption that no one will dare oppose them, and they exploit silence as permission. The president's arrogance, though grating, told me more about her than she realized. She was the kind of person who thrived on intimidation, and I had met her kind before, many times. Then came the letter that shifted everything. Unlike the earlier notices, which were irritating but relatively minor, this one accused me of unauthorized modifications to my property. Specifically, it claimed that the shutters I had repainted, a subtle, darker shade of brown than the original, violated the community's approved color palette. The letter was not merely a notice, it was a demand. According to the document, I had 30 days to repaint the shutters or face escalating fines, which could ultimately lead to legal action and even foreclosure proceedings if left unresolved. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. A set of shutters painted to a shade nearly indistinguishable from the original had suddenly been inflated into a matter of financial and legal consequence. I reread the letter several times, each word dripping with arrogance, as if the president and her board truly believed they held unquestionable power to threaten someone's home over the color of paint. For most, such a letter would inspire fear, perhaps even compliance. But for me, it had the opposite effect. My career had been spent in courtrooms where real matters of justice were weighed, cases where lives, rights, and freedoms hung in the balance. And now, in my retirement, I was being threatened over paint. The absurdity was almost too much to process. Still, I didn't act right away. I knew better than to respond with anger or haste. Instead, I began documenting everything. I photographed the shutters, compared them to the original shade, and collected testimonies from neighbors who agreed the difference was negligible. I researched the HOA's bylaws, digging through the dense language they so often use to intimidate residents. And in doing so, I discovered something telling. The bylaws were riddled with inconsistencies, vague wording, and, most importantly, outright violations of state property law. It was clear to me then that this president wasn't simply overzealous. She was reckless. In her hunger for control, she had overstepped boundaries that protected homeowners from abuse of power. And while many in the neighborhood may not have had the tools or the will to fight her, I had both. But I also had something else, something she could not have anticipated. I wasn't just a retired professional. I wasn't just another homeowner, weary of HOA politics. I was a federal judge carrying years of experience in dissecting laws, exposing misconduct, and dismantling abuse of authority. My career had been built on uncovering lies and demanding accountability. And though I had stepped away from the bench, I had not stepped away from my principles. As I folded the letter back into its envelope, I knew a battle was coming. What the HOA president believed was a simple matter of intimidation was about to become her undoing. She had chosen the wrong target, and soon she would discover just how costly her arrogance would be. The calm before the storm had ended. The real fight was about to begin. The letter about my shutters was only the beginning. For many in the neighborhood, it might have been enough to prompt a hasty trip to the hardware store, a weekend of repainting, and an uneasy acceptance of the HOA's authority. That is exactly what the president counted on, unquestioned obedience. But when my silence stretched past the first week, when she saw no evidence of compliance, the president's tone shifted from officious to openly hostile. A second letter arrived, thicker than the first. Inside, a formal notice of violation cited me for not only the shutter paint, but several new alleged infractions. My garbage bins, she claimed, had been left visible from the street for more than 24 hours. My lawn, she insisted, had patches of discoloration that detracted from community standards. Even the bird feeder I had hung near the porch was suddenly labeled an unapproved structure. Each accusation came with its own fine, the numbers climbing into the hundreds. The letter concluded with the stark threat of a lien should I refuse to comply. To an outsider, this might have seemed like simple bureaucratic harassment. To me, it was an attempted squeeze, an escalation meant to pressure me into submission. This president had likely run this same playbook on others. Flood the homeowner with violations, overwhelm them with the threat of financial burden, and force them to either comply or surrender. But where she saw intimidation, I saw opportunity. Each letter, each violation, each fabricated infraction became a brick in the wall of evidence I was quietly constructing. I did not immediately respond to her notices. Instead, I doubled down on documentation. I took daily photographs of my property, time-stamped and cataloged. I retained receipts for lawn treatments, irrigation maintenance, and even paint samples. I spoke quietly with neighbors, learning how many had faced similar harassment and how many had felt cornered into paying thousands to keep the HOA at bay. Some even admitted they had contemplated selling their homes just to escape the endless cycle of fines and hostility. Their voices, nervous but eager to be heard, painted a picture of a neighborhood held hostage by the unchecked power of one woman and her compliant board. It was not long before the harassment escalated further. The HOA newsletter, delivered monthly to every mailbox, suddenly featured a thinly veiled commentary about residents who endanger community harmony by refusing to respect rules. The words were general, but the implication was clear. Neighbors cast furtive glances my way during walks, whispering assumptions about what might be happening. The president had begun her smear campaign, hoping to isolate me socially before tightening her grip financially. It was a strategy built on shame, but shame only works when the target is guilty, and I was far from guilty. Then came the most audacious move yet, an emergency board meeting scheduled with less than 48 hours' notice. I received the notice taped to my front door, its language cold and formal, demanding my presence to answer for repeated violations. It was not a request, but a summons, dripping with the self-importance of someone who believed she wielded legal authority she did not possess. For most homeowners, such a summons would be terrifying. For me, it was revealing. I knew the limits of HOA power, limits that the president either ignored or deliberately concealed from her neighbors. An HOA board cannot conduct a tribunal as if it were a courtroom. They cannot levy fines without due process, and they certainly cannot threaten foreclosure without substantial and lawful justification. The president's attempt to transform a community meeting into a trial was not only improper, it was unlawful. She was playing judge, jury, and executioner, ironically unaware of the real judge who lived quietly in her jurisdiction. The day of the meeting arrived, and I attended, not to argue, but to observe. The board sat at a long table with the president, at the center like a queen presiding over her council. A handful of residents watched from the chairs arranged along the wall, their eyes darting nervously between me and the board. The president spoke first, rattling off my supposed violations with a theatrical flair that made the minor accusations sound like grievous crimes. She waved photographs, grainy, unclear images of my yard and porch, claiming they proved noncompliance. Each charge was followed by her demand for immediate corrective action or escalating fines. I remained silent. Years in the courtroom had taught me the value of silence in the face of theatrics. Let the performance unfold. Let the actor reveal herself, and only then respond with precision. The more she spoke, the more reckless her claims became. At one point, she even declared that failure to comply could result in the association, taking ownership of the property to preserve community standards. That sentence alone was damning. She had wandered so far outside the boundaries of lawful HOA power that she had effectively handed me the evidence of her abuse. Neighbors shifted, uncomfortably in their chairs, some whispering in disbelief. But none dared to speak up. The atmosphere was heavy with intimidation, the president's tone brooking no dissent. When she finally turned to me and demanded a response, I offered nothing more than a calm nod and a quiet assurance that her comments had been noted. It infuriated her. She wanted outrage. She wanted submission. What she received was composure. When the meeting concluded, I left without protest, my neighbors' eyes following me as I walked out. Some looked sympathetic, others fearful, but all of them understood that something unusual was unfolding. The president, meanwhile, wore the smug expression of someone convinced she had triumphed. She believed she had cornered me, that the weight of fines and threats would soon push me into compliance. What she did not know was that every step she took drew her closer to her own undoing. Over the next several weeks, the letters continued, each one more aggressive than the last. Threats of liens became threats of foreclosure. The fines ballooned to outrageous amounts, justified by fabricated infractions that had no basis in law or fact. She had crossed the line from overreach into outright harassment. For most, this would have been the breaking point. For me, it was the final confirmation of what I already knew. The HOA president had turned her role into a personal dictatorship, one that could not be allowed to continue unchecked. By then, my evidence file had grown thick. Photographs, letters, newsletters, meeting notes, and testimonies from neighbors, all carefully organized, all ready to be used. I had not yet revealed my hand, not yet shown her who she was truly dealing with. But the moment was coming because, while she believed she was the authority in this neighborhood, she had unknowingly declared war on someone who had spent their life upholding the true authority of law. She thought she was dealing with just another homeowner. She had no idea she was dealing with a federal judge who had dismantled far more dangerous figures than a petty HOA tyrant. The storm she had summoned was about to break. The longer I remained silent, the bolder the HOA president became. Silence, to her, was weakness. She mistook my composure for fear, my lack of outward resistance for surrender. What she could not grasp was that my silence was not the silence of defeat, but of strategy. Every week that passed, every notice she delivered, every insult she slipped into the HOA newsletter was another piece of evidence layered onto the foundation I was quietly constructing. By this point, my file had grown thick. Neatly organized folders contained the original violation letters, subsequent threats, and the steadily increasing fines. I had printed out the newsletter where she had indirectly slandered me. I kept meticulous photographs of my home and property, each time stamped to prove the falsity of her accusations. But the strongest evidence would not come from documents alone. It would come from the people she had wronged before me. I began to reach out discreetly, a conversation on a morning walk, a brief chat while checking mail, a friendly question at the local cafe, small, quiet moments that opened the door to something larger. Slowly, my neighbors began to share their own experiences. Some had been fined for planting flowers outside the narrow list of approved species. Others had been cited for leaving a holiday decoration up for a single day beyond the arbitrary deadline. One family had even faced threats of foreclosure over a minor delay in paying annual dues. The pattern was unmistakable, a regime of control enforced through intimidation, sustained by fear, and fueled by the arrogance of a president, who believed herself untouchable. As neighbors spoke, I took notes, careful to capture details that could later be corroborated. Several offered to provide written statements. Others, though nervous, were willing to testify if it came to that. For many, the simple act of being listened to seemed to provide a measure of relief they had long been denied. It became clear that this was bigger than just my shutters, my lawn, or my bird feeder. The president had created an environment where homeowners no longer felt like owners at all, but tenants under the watchful eye of an unyielding landlord. She had taken the concept of community standards and twisted it into a weapon, wielded not for the benefit of all, but for her own sense of dominance. What she did not realize was that by targeting me, she had chosen the wrong opponent. While I gathered testimony, the harassment intensified. Notices arrived almost weekly now, each with escalating threats. At one point, I was accused of having an unapproved vehicle parked in my driveway, a baseless claim given that my car was a standard sedan well within all guidelines. Another letter claimed I had made structural modifications without board approval, referencing nothing more than the simple bird feeder I had long since documented. Each false claim was added to my evidence file, their very absurdity strengthening the case against her. Behind the scenes, I also began reviewing the HOA's governing documents, the bylaws, covenants, and state statutes that defined the limits of their authority were to me as familiar as the pages of a well-worn book. Years of legal training allowed me to spot flaws, contradictions, and outright violations with ease. The president had overstepped repeatedly, her threats and actions far beyond the scope of what the law allowed. She had operated under the assumption that no one in the community had the knowledge or courage to challenge her. That assumption was about to be shattered. But it was not enough to simply prepare a case. Timing mattered. Exposure mattered. The moment had to be chosen carefully, not only to halt her harassment of me, but to protect the broader community from further abuse. A premature move could risk alerting her before the evidence was airtight. A hasty confrontation could fracture the neighborhood rather than unite it. No, the reveal would need to be decisive, undeniable, and public. So I waited. I continued to collect, to listen, to observe. I let her believe she was winning. And as she celebrated her imagined victories, her arrogance grew. And with it, her mistakes multiplied. The opportunity finally came when another neighbor, an elderly widow living 2 streets over, received a notice threatening foreclosure for a supposed failure to pay dues. She insisted she had paid in full and produced receipts to prove it. Yet the president continued to pursue her, sending letters that frightened her into tears. When the widow confided in me, her voice trembling, I knew this was the moment the neighborhood would see the president for what she truly was. I encouraged the widow to attend the next HOA meeting and promised her that she would not stand alone. Quietly, I coordinated with several other neighbors who had agreed to speak out. Together, they would form a chorus too loud to ignore, and I would be there, not yet as the judge they didn't know I was, but as the calm, prepared neighbor who had been documenting every abuse. The day of the meeting arrived. Once again, the board sat in their familiar formation, the president, presiding with her usual air of authority. But this time, the room was fuller. More residents had come, drawn by whispers of discontent and stories of overreach. The widow spoke first, her voice shaky but clear, holding up her receipts as proof of payment. When the president tried to dismiss her, other neighbors interjected with their own experiences. One by one, voices rose, recounting fines, threats, and lies. The room that had once been cowed into silence now buzzed with anger. The president tried to regain control, banging her gavel and demanding order, but the tide had turned. She had expected compliance. Instead, she was met with resistance. Her carefully constructed facade of authority began to crack as more and more residents spoke, emboldened by the sight of others standing beside them. I remained quiet, watching, documenting, allowing the scene to unfold. This was not yet the moment for my revelation. That moment would come later, when her denials had trapped her, when her lies had cornered her beyond escape. For now, it was enough to let the neighborhood see the truth for themselves. The meeting ended in chaos, the president storming out, her composure shattered, her control slipping. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain how much longer they could defend her. The neighbors lingered in clusters, whispering, some relieved, some anxious, but all aware that something had changed. And I walked home with the knowledge that the case I had been building was nearly complete. The president had overreached, overplayed her hand, and exposed her true nature to the very people she relied upon for power. She believed she had silenced me. In reality, I was just waiting for the perfect moment to speak, and when I did, it would end her reign once and for all. The weeks following that explosive meeting were tense, heavy with an undercurrent of unease. The president, shaken though she was, did not retreat. That was not her nature. To back down in her eyes would have been weakness. Instead, she doubled down. Where before she had wielded her authority like a knife, now she wielded it like a blunt instrument, striking harder, less precisely, hoping brute force would re-establish control. Within days, another wave of violation notices appeared in mailboxes across the neighborhood. Trivialities were elevated into supposed offenses. A garden hose not coiled to her satisfaction, a child's toy left on a porch overnight, a mailbox with chipped paint. Fines multiplied, threats of liens increased, and the tone of her letters grew sharper, less professional, more personal. It was no longer about maintaining community standards. It was about punishing dissent, crushing resistance, and reasserting dominance. But this time, the effect was different. Rather than bowing to pressure, residents whispered among themselves. Many had witnessed the courage of the widow at the last meeting. They had seen how others rallied to her side. They remembered the rare but powerful feeling of standing together. The president had hoped fear would divide them. Instead, her escalation was uniting them. I observed quietly, noting each new letter, cataloging each new abuse. My evidence file, already thick, was becoming undeniable. But beyond paper and testimony, something more important was happening. The neighborhood itself was awakening. Where before eyes had lowered and voices had hushed, now there was solidarity. Neighbors checked in on one another. Some formed informal gatherings to compare notes. Others began questioning why the board allowed one person such unchecked power. The board, too, was showing cracks. Several members, once loyal to the president, now seemed uneasy. They had tolerated her strong-handed style when it appeared effective. But after the meeting and in the face of growing unrest, they found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Her authority was eroding, and anyone tied too closely to her risked being dragged down as well. Sensing this, the president pushed harder. She called an emergency board meeting, closed to residents, claiming urgent business. Yet word of what transpired reached me quickly. She demanded the board grant her expanded enforcement powers, arguing that the neighborhood was spiraling into chaos and that only firm leadership could restore order. Some members hesitated, others objected, but her voice dominated the room, drowning out dissent. By the end, though, no formal vote had been taken, and her demands remained unmet. It was a small but telling defeat. In her desperation, she turned her attention back to me. I was, in her eyes, the root of the problem. My calm resistance, my refusal to bend, my presence at the meetings, these had emboldened others. If she could silence me, perhaps she could silence them. So she escalated her attacks, targeting me with increasingly absurd violations. One notice accused me of harboring unapproved structures, pointing to my perfectly ordinary garden shed, which had stood unchanged for years. Another claimed my lawn ornaments created a public hazard. When these failed to provoke a reaction, she went further, sending a letter alleging that I had failed to pay dues, an outright lie contradicted by my bank records. Each new claim was added to my file, each falsehood strengthening the case. What she thought was an attack was, in reality, her own undoing. Still, I let her believe she was tightening the noose. I remained outwardly calm, never defensive, never combative, allowing her to dig herself deeper with every step. Meanwhile, I prepared for the inevitable. The time for revelation was approaching. My evidence was organized, my legal citations ready, my neighbors' testimonies compiled. But beyond the paperwork, I was preparing the stage. Exposure was not enough. It had to be public, undeniable, and final. She had built her power on intimidation and illusion. To dismantle it, the truth needed to be revealed where all could see. Opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. The HOA announced the next general meeting, scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the community center. The president clearly intended it as a show of strength, a chance to reassert her dominance. Before the entire neighborhood, She had sent out a notice describing the meeting as mandatory, claiming critical issues would be addressed and warning that failure to comply with HOA directives may result in severe consequences. The tone was unmistakable. This was not an invitation, but a summons. I knew then that this would be the moment. She would attempt to crush dissent publicly, and I would be ready to respond. My evidence file was no longer just a stack of papers. It was a weapon, one carefully forged over weeks of patience. And I had something she could never anticipate: my true identity. The days leading up to the meeting were marked by whispers and anticipation. Neighbors speculated about what the president might announce. Some feared harsher rules, others suspected she would target specific families. Few expected good news. Yet beneath the anxiety, there was also a sense of quiet defiance. People had begun to realize that her power was not absolute, that together they could resist. The morning of the meeting, I reviewed my file one last time. Each document was in order, each testimony prepared, each photograph labeled. My robe, folded neatly in a garment bag, remained untouched for now. That final reveal would wait until the precise moment. Timing, as always, was everything. When the hour arrived, the community center filled quickly. Rows of folding chairs faced the long table where the board sat, the president at its center like a monarch on her throne. Her expression was stern, her gavel poised, her eyes scanning the room with the same arrogance that had long cowed her subjects. But this time there was an unease beneath her composure. She had felt the shift in the air, though she did not yet understand its full weight. She began the meeting with her usual rhetoric, speaking of order, compliance, and responsibility. She listed alleged violations across the neighborhood, painting a picture of chaos only she could control. Her voice was commanding, her tone uncompromising. Yet as she spoke, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were no longer listening with blind obedience. They were skeptical, questioning, waiting. When she turned her accusations toward me, reading aloud a list of supposed violations, painting me as an example of disobedience, I remained calm. I sat quietly, hands folded, eyes steady, letting her dig her own grave with every word. She believed she was humiliating me, isolating me. In truth, she was setting the stage for her own downfall. The moment of revelation was near. Soon I would rise. Soon I would speak. And when I did, the illusion of her power would shatter like glass dropped on stone. The air inside the community center that afternoon was thick with tension. Folding chairs creaked as neighbors shifted uneasily, whispering in low voices. Children fidgeted while their parents tried to keep them quiet, their eyes fixed on the table where the HOA board sat. At the center of it all, the president presided with the haughty air of someone who believed herself untouchable. She banged her gavel once, sharp and commanding, and the murmurs died down. She launched into a speech about order and responsibility, repeating the same phrases she had wielded for years as weapons of intimidation. She spoke of violations, of fines, of the need for unity under strong leadership, her leadership. Every word dripped with authority, but beneath it ran an unmistakable current of desperation. Then, inevitably, she turned her attention to me. She recited a litany of supposed violations: my shed, my ornaments, my failure to pay dues. Each claim more absurd than the last. Her voice carried across the room, sharp and accusatory, her gaze fixed on me with the intensity of a predator, ready to strike. She intended to humiliate me, to break the quiet defiance that had been spreading among the neighbors. I let her finish. I let her revel in her imagined victory for one final moment. And then, slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair. All eyes followed me as I stood, calm and steady, holding the thick file I had prepared. The room grew silent, a hush falling over the crowd as if they sensed something monumental was about to unfold. "I have heard the accusations," I began, my voice clear but even, not raised in anger but resonant with authority. "And I believe it is time the truth was brought into the light." I opened the file, drawing out the first set of documents. Here are the payment records for my dues, every one of them on time, every one documented by my bank. The claim of delinquency is false. Here are photographs of my property, taken the same day as the violation notices. My shed is compliant, my ornaments are harmless, and the so-called infractions are fabrications. And here, I continued, flipping, through the stack, are testimonies from neighbors who have received similar baseless violations, threatened with fines, intimidated with threats of liens. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide, recognizing their own stories in the words I read aloud. The president shifted in her chair, her face tight, her hands gripping the arms of her seat. Still, she tried to interject, banging her gavel and calling for order, but her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of murmurs from the residents. I continued without pause, presenting evidence after evidence, each page a brick in the wall of truth closing in around her. What we have here is not a matter of community standards, but a pattern of abuse, of power wielded not for the good of this neighborhood, but for the ego and control of one individual. This is harassment, plain and simple, dressed in the language of authority. By now, the board members were visibly uncomfortable. Some avoided the president's gaze, others stared at the documents in shock. The room was no longer under her control. It was shifting, irrevocably, toward truth. And then, when the weight of the evidence had fully sunk in, when the silence of realization had fallen heavy over the crowd, I delivered the final revelation. With deliberate calm, I reached into the garment bag at my side and withdrew the robe. Slowly, I unfolded it and slipped it on, the black fabric draping over my shoulders. The room seemed to freeze. "I have not yet told you who I am," I said, my voice carrying through the stunned silence. "For many years I have served this nation not as a soldier, not as a politician, but as a judge, a federal judge, sworn to uphold the law and defend the rights of citizens against precisely this kind of abuse. I came to this neighborhood as a resident, hoping for peace, for community. What I found was tyranny masquerading as governance. And now, with the evidence before us all, I tell you this: it ends today." The effect was immediate. Gasps turned into exclamations. Neighbors looked at one another in disbelief, their faces shifting from shock to exhilaration. The board members sat frozen, their eyes darting between me and the president. And the president herself, once so confident, so unyielding, had gone pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her gavel slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table, the sharp sound echoing in the stunned quiet. I stepped closer to the board's table, laying the thick file before them. Every violation fabricated, every fine issued without basis, every threat of seizure, it is all here. This is not governance, this is harassment, this is extortion, and it will not stand. The president finally found her voice, stammering something about overstepping and confidentiality. But the words rang hollow. No one was listening. Her illusion of power had shattered in an instant. Neighbors stood, applauding, cheering, their voices filling the room with a collective relief that had been pent up for years. The fear that had once silenced them was gone, replaced by courage born of truth. For the first time, the community stood not as isolated individuals, but as one, united against the corruption that had plagued them. I did not bask in their cheers. My role was not to be celebrated, but to uphold justice. Instead, I addressed the board firmly. You have a choice. Either remove this president immediately and begin the process of reform, or I will escalate this matter to the federal level. I have the authority, the evidence, and the obligation to ensure that justice is served." The board exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the weight of my words. To defy them would be to invite consequences far beyond their control. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. The president sat frozen, her face drained of color, her authority crumbling around her. She had tried to seize my home, to strip me of my dignity, to wield power unchecked. Now she found herself exposed, her empire of intimidation reduced to rubble. And yet the final reckoning was still to come. For though she sat silent now, the question remained. Would she surrender quietly, or would she fight to the bitter end? The president's silence did not last. After the first wave of shock passed, she straightened in her chair and attempted to salvage what remained of her authority. Her voice trembled as she declared that my revelations were a gross misrepresentation, that I had twisted facts to incite the neighborhood against her. She tried to rally the board with sharp glances and accusatory words, but her allies avoided her gaze. They had been complicit for too long, but now that the curtain had been pulled back, none were willing to follow her into the abyss. Still, she pressed on. She accused me of fabricating evidence, of staging an elaborate deception to discredit her. The words spilled out quickly, desperate, untethered from reason. She clung to the only weapon she had left, denial. But it was a flimsy shield against the truth that now stood undeniable before everyone. The crowd did not buy it. Neighbors who had once remained silent now rose to their feet, voices strong, recounting their own experiences. A father spoke of being threatened with fines for his children's sidewalk chalk drawings. A widow described being harassed for leaving a flower pot on her porch. One after another, the stories poured out, echoing mine, weaving a tapestry of shared injustice. Each testimony was a nail in the coffin of her credibility. The room became a courtroom, and the verdict was forming in real time. I listened, letting the people speak, their voices carrying the weight of years of frustration. When the clamor settled, I stepped forward once more. "You see," I said, calm but resolute, "this is not about me alone. This is about a community, held hostage by fear and intimidation. The evidence is clear. The testimonies are clear. What has happened here is a betrayal of trust, and it ends tonight." The board, now cornered, whispered among themselves. It was obvious that the tide had turned. When their quiet discussion ended, one of them, the treasurer, a man who had remained mostly silent until now, spoke aloud. "I move to remove the president from her position effective immediately." A second quickly followed, then a third. The motion carried with unanimous support, not a single dissenting voice. The president sat stunned, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the table as if to anchor herself to a power that was already slipping away. She tried to object, but the words fell flat. For the first time, her gavel meant nothing. Neighbors erupted. In applause, the sound rolling through the hall like thunder. Relief radiated from their faces as though a storm had finally passed. For years they had endured her reign of intimidation, and now, in a single evening, the chains had been broken. I removed my robe, folding it neatly before placing it on the table. "Justice does not always come in courtrooms," I said, my voice carrying over the applause. "Sometimes it begins in community halls and neighborhoods in the courage of ordinary people who refuse to bow to fear. Tonight you chose justice. Tonight you chose freedom." The president, her composure finally shattered, stormed out of the room. Her exit was not triumphant, but pitiful, the once commanding figure reduced to a shadow. Neighbors watched her go, not with fear, but with a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. But the story did not end with her departure. Over the next weeks, the neighborhood transformed. The board, now free from her stranglehold, worked with the residents to rebuild trust. Policies were revised, fines were reviewed, and in many cases rescinded. The oppressive culture that had defined the HOA began to dissolve, replaced by collaboration and transparency. For the first time in years, neighbors gathered not in fear of violations, but in celebration of community. Potlucks were organized. Children played freely, and homes no longer bore the silent weight of intimidation. The neighborhood felt alive again. I remained a resident, not as a judge looming over them, but as a neighbor among them. I did not flaunt my authority or my title. My role had been to shine light on the truth, to stop the abuse, and once that was done, I returned to the simple desire that had brought me there in the first place: to live in peace. Yet word of what had happened spread beyond our community. Other neighborhoods began reaching out, curious, inspired. They wanted to know how we had stood up, how we had reclaimed our homes and our dignity. I shared our story not as a tale of one person's triumph, but as a reminder of what happens when ordinary people find their voice. The former president faced consequences beyond our neighborhood. With the evidence I had compiled, investigations followed. Financial records were scrutinized, misuse of funds uncovered. What she had wielded as unchecked power became her downfall. The law she had twisted for personal gain became the very thing that held her accountable. For me, there was no triumph in her downfall, only closure. Justice is not about vengeance, but restoration, about ensuring that wrongs are righted and rights are protected. I watched as the neighborhood healed, as laughter returned to streets once patrolled by fear, and I knew the fight had been worth it. On quiet evenings, I often sat on my porch, the same porch she once threatened to strip from me, and listened to the sounds of a community finally at peace. The clink of dishes at shared dinners, the shouts of children chasing each other through yards, the hum of conversation drifting on the breeze, all small, ordinary sounds, but together they formed a symphony of freedom. I had not sought to reveal who I was, nor had I wished to wield my title as a weapon. But when faced with tyranny, silence is complicity. That night in the community center, when I unfolded the robe, I had not done it for myself. I had done it for every voice she had tried to silence, for every neighbor who had lived in fear, and, as I reflected on the journey, I knew one truth above all. Power, no matter how absolute it may seem, crumbles when confronted with truth. The gavel she once clung to so tightly had fallen silent, but the gavel of justice had echoed, firm and final. The neighborhood was free, justice had been rendered, and peace at last had returned.